So hello to everybody. My name is Julia Streets and it's a great privilege to be with you today as part of Lesbian Disability Week in association with DIVA. Now, of course, we'd all be sitting around a table having this conversation, possibly on a platform, possibly at a live event, but these are extraordinary times. So it's a great pleasure to be doing this over Zoom and to welcome our three guests today. Today, we're going to be talking about tips from the top. And now this is one of a series of incredible contents that DIVA is curating throughout the course of this week. So if you want to know anything about resilience, anything about how to thrive and survive in these extraordinary times, insights about your careers, also thinking about a subject very dear to all our hearts, I'm sure, about sexual desire, do be sure you look at the DIVA website and follow everything that's going on this week, because it is an incredibly important week where we talk about lesbian visibility. And what was incredibly important in all of this discussion is that we do have real role models talking about issues that face the lesbian community, both here in the UK and then also abroad, because we do recognise that DIVA has listeners and supporters and followers and readers all over the world as well. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome today. We have Phyll Opoku-Gyimah, who is the Executive Director and co-founder of UK Black Pride. Welcome. Some people call you Lady Phyll. If I could call you Phyll, does that work for you?
That's absolutely fine. I'm happy with however you want to call me. And thank you for letting me be here.
Pleasure. It's wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're also joined by Baroness Liz Barker. Baroness, welcome. It's great to see you today.
Oh, lovely. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Now, to explain, Baroness Barker is a Liberal Democrat life peer who sat under this title in the House of Lords since 1999. So we're very honoured to have her here. And she undertakes the role of Liberal Democrats Lords spokesperson for the voluntary sector and also for equalities as well. So looking forward to your insights as well. And last but no means least, it's a pleasure to welcome Margot Slattery, who is the Global Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Sodexo Group. Margot, welcome. Great to see you today.
All right, thank you, Julia. Wonderful to be here, and thank you for including me. It's great to be on.
Not at all. I'm really interested in your insights as well, because from what I understand, your journey at Sodexo has been really fascinating, from a junior manager right the way through to managing director position as well, country president for Ireland and Northern Ireland, and then now global chief diversity and inclusion officer as well. So many insights and much to learn about that. So the idea of today is really just to have a very informal but yet insightful conversation about career journeys, life lessons, tips from the top, exactly as it is billed. So I'd really like to start let's explore some of those career journeys. And Phyll, could I come to you first of all? Tell us a bit about your career journey and what's led to you to where you are today.
Wow. Okay. Thank you very much. And you know what? It's great that this is for DIVA and it's Lesbian Visibility Week. We don't get to talk enough about being lesbian. So just really briefly, in terms of my career history, I started off as a civil servant back in the days when it was called like the Employment Service, and then the Job Centre, then Job Centre Plus. I went to Fraud Investigation Service as well. I was not the greatest fraud investigator, but I did the job. And then I moved over to the trade union, which was the trade union that looked after civil servants, and that's PCS, Public and Commercial Services Union. And I happened to be the first Black senior negotiator within public and commercial services in the bargaining area for law and justice. I then moved up and was then the head of equality and inclusion. All of this whilst still trying to study as well at the same time. And then from there, I moved to head of political campaigns and equality in the trade union. And I stayed with the trade union for just over 10 years. And I won't say recently be appointed, but in August, I was appointed as the new executive director of Kaleidoscope Trust. And those of you that know Kaleidoscope Trust, it's an amazing LGBT human rights global charity that seeks to address some of the issues around colonial era laws that exist in countries where LGBT plus persons are still criminalized and face torture, persecution, and massive amounts of discrimination. And I'm still there. But I also have had lots of side things that I do. I am the founder and executive director of UK Black Pride. UK Black Pride was an organisation which was primarily set up to address inequalities whilst fighting and challenging homophobia, biphobia and transphobia, but to also look at the structural and systemic racism which exists within our LGBT plus community and outside of it. I'm also the AKT patron because I'm very, very, clear that my support for young people, especially young people who have been made homeless through coming out to families and then they've been ostracized and marginalized, is a key part of what I want to change and see change in the world, because it's the next generation. So yeah, there's more. I could go on. And I'm also a DIVA columnist, which I'm really happy to say. So I write for DIVA. I used to write for DIVA on a regular basis. Now it's more ad hoc due to a number of other activities that I have.
And I can imagine through all of that, you have an enormous following of people who are not only thrilled to hear you today, but also fascinated by career insights and also, your representation of the community as well. And what I love of the story you tell is how actually you really seem to tackle the things that are hard to address as much as it is about representation and role modelling as well. So it's wonderful to hear your thoughts, and we'll definitely come back to you as well. Baroness, or Liz, if I may call you Liz, let's come to you. Tell us about your career journey.
Oh, my career journey is very different. I went to university, lucky enough to go to university in 1979. And one of the first things that I did was I joined the then Liberal Student Society. I knew I wasn't a Tory and I had voted Liberal at the election. So I did that. And when I left university, I had a sabbatical post for a year as chair of the Union Liberal Students. And after that, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And by accident, I fell into a job with a charity called Age Concern. And the job was supposed to last for 3 months. And 23 years later, I finally left Age Concern, having done a variety of different jobs, starting off as a program, then a grants officer, and then working up to be something which is probably one of the most fascinating jobs I ever did, which was to be like a management consultant for charities. Being a management consultant in the commercial world actually is pretty easy in comparison, because it's the bottom line. In charities, it's much, much more complicated, with volunteers and people doing things for all sorts of passionate reasons, and doing things and usually working way above the level of their pay grade if they're employees. So doing management and organisation development, and that is 100 times harder than it is in the private sector. And I continued to do that, but then the big career change, or the big career hit, came in 1999, when, much to my surprise, I was asked to go into the House of Lords. I honestly had not seen that coming. I really didn't. And with some trepidation, I took it on. And it has turned out to be the most enormous privilege. And I should say this: people look at the House of Lords and they think that the privileges are things like titles and robes. No. The big privilege is that you get to work with amazing people, and you get to work on legislation and to make a difference to people's lives. And then I think the thing that probably has had the biggest influence on my career choices was actually being a member of several invisible minorities. I've always been, from being a kid, I've always been a member of multiple invisible minorities. But the biggest one was being a lesbian, because, back in the day, when I first met my wife over 30 years ago, she worked in the city. Well, nobody came out in the city and lived. I mean, it was just a death sentence for your career. So we had to sort of get her out of the city, and she went off to do other things. I'm glad to say that things have changed dramatically. But I was very fortunate that it was to be working in charities at the time when that was the place when there was a lot of social change, and particularly change around people from minority groups. So it was all very random, I have to say, but I had been extremely lucky.
And I love, there really is no pun intended at all, but I love the fact that actually in many ways you kind of grew up in your career with age concern, which is, you know, to have such a long tenure and then do the transformation out of that into ultimately the House of Lords. You can see that there's fascinating parallels around policy and legislation, or legislature, I should say, but then also very different organisations as well. Fantastic. Thank you so much for those insights. We'll come back to much of that. Certainly. And Margot, now you're on your iPhone at the moment. I love that you're sort of tucked away into your iPhone. So tell us about you. I mentioned at the beginning about your journey with Sodexo. So talk to us about your career journey too.
Sure, and hopefully you can hear me okay, and that I'm not too near the phone, but these are all testing times. I guess it's been, imagine, nearly 30 years with Sodexo. I never intended it to be that long. It kind of just happened. But that's the way I think with lots of these things. I started my career really as a young person who was interested in the hotel industry. My mum had done hotel management, and when I left school in 1985, a very long time ago, I really didn't know what I wanted to do, but I had this kind of notion that I wanted to be in the food and hotel industry. I thought it was really glamorous, probably a lot less than I thought at the time. And I went to college in Galway in Ireland and trained as a chef initially, having done something in a place called Ballymaloo, which was a cookery school, and I loved food, etc. I went from there, I went and I worked after going to college in Galway. I went and worked internationally and spent a couple of years living in London in the late 80s and early 90s. Very exciting time in my life. I was probably a little bit of a wild child, and I didn't sort of settle down to anything. And and the reason I kind of tell you this background was that there was a kind of a pivotal moment around, I think, 1990, and I came back to Ireland for a very short period of time, for which I was getting ready and preparing to go to either the US or Australia to live for good. And anyhow, I came to live in Dublin for a little while and started my coming out journey because I was staying there. And kind of that changed everything. Now it wasn't a very sort of a welcome place in Dublin in that way, but I began to find a community, and that began to, I suppose, change my life. And shortly after that, I decided that it was maybe time I went back to college and got a little bit more serious about everything. So I went back to college by nights, and I did hotel management, and I joined a company called Gardner Merchant, which was a UK company, latterly became Sodexo in 1991. And I literally worked about 20-something jobs over that period of time, resulting in becoming the managing director in 2012 for Ireland, for the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and then country president, and did that until literally last August. So it's been a journey of many differences. And I suppose maybe the part, and I'm sure we'll come to these things throughout the interview, the part that's been quite different and led me in different directions is that outside of all that, I've probably been a strong activist most of my life, very involved in lesbian politics, and in lesbian organizations and LGBTQ plus organizations in Ireland in the main, and very involved with marriage equality. So there was sort of two different journeys happening at the same time.
Wow, amazing. And thank you for that. And I'm going to come back to you in a second about sort of when you've been thinking about all those 20 odd different jobs you've been doing, is which ones you went for or which ones just kind of landed in your lap, and how that all came to be. I wonder if I could just crave a little bit of people's time, just to explain who on earth I am, if I may. So Liz, you were talking about life in the city. That is my life, actually. So I've spent 20 odd years in financial services, and my niche really is financial services and technology. And similar story, I spent a good old chunk of my time begging not to be asked the question what I did at the weekend. And it's not that I was doing anything particularly exciting, it was just the whole point about coming out, I was convinced was going to destroy my career. I'm an entrepreneur. I set up my own company about 13 years ago. And in addition to running this business all around fintech, financial services, technology, I started a podcast about 2.5 years ago. I was standing in the House of Commons listening to a lot of corporates talk about how committed to diversity and inclusion they were, and wondering why, when I've met amazing people who are doing incredible things, the world is not changing faster. So I started this podcast called Diversity Podcast. See what I did there? And so I've now interviewed hundreds of leaders thinking about diversity and inclusion right the way across the spectrum. So this is actually something I'm very, very close to my heart. It has actually helped me in many ways come out publicly on that journey as well. And I live in London with my wife and avid DIVA reader. So I think I'm quite qualified for this job, I like to think. In addition to that, I also should mention I'm a stand-up comedian. So hopefully what I'm going to do is also bring a bit of life and joy to the conversation too. So I've been looking forward to it very much. But Margot, I'm coming straight back to you, just straight back to you about, your 20 jobs. And, was those jobs you went for internally within the organization, were they ones you saw and you went, I want to go for that? Or did they land in your lap? Tell us a bit about, was it linear? Was it progressive? How did you find your next jobs?
I think probably by being incredibly pushy and having an end goal in line. If I'm really honest, I came from very average background and probably was never sort of brought up to have big expectations. My parents would have liked if I'd married. I came from a farming background and would have liked if I'd married the guy next door. It would have been all very convenient. And I think, I knew myself that I was escaping from something and, in early days didn't quite know what that might have been. So I put a lot of myself into work. And once I started to settle down and join the organization, I declared to somebody, I think very early days as a young manager, that I wanted to be the managing director one day. And I literally had a plan. And I pushed and I pushed and I pushed till I got there. It's a huffed and puffed and pushed the past down kind of thing.
Mm. And what was the response to that? Did you have mentors and sponsors around you who said, absolutely good for you, go for it? Or did you feel some resistance of people going, well, that's a little ambitious. I don't think you should be thinking like that.
I think, probably bits of everything. The biggest challenge I had was not being out in the early days in work. And I felt really, and, remembering that Ireland even was behind the UK. So I felt that was a really tough one. Because I was always fearful that, if somebody found out in work, what would happen, etc. And therefore, I had to be more guarded about who I told things to and what. Having said that, there were some people who were absolutely fantastic, some managers and some leaders I had who've been fantastic. And to this day, our current chief executive and a number of people in the organization have been big supporters. And the lady I've replaced actually as chief diversity officer was also a very early day supporter of mine. So, some great people along the way. And I would have maybe revealed things when I felt safe. And that was always, something I had to traverse my way through.
Mm-hmm. And the move from being sort of on the commercial side, if you like, to then moving into a global diversity and inclusion role is a very interesting step, actually, in my opinion, in that a lot of people tend to find that's more of an HR style of role. And yet it's obviously one that you're clearly very passionate about. Tell us about the transition into that.
Well, I guess I've been doing the commercial role for 6-7 years and, obviously a long time before that. And I was at a certain age in my life, I was looking and thinking, what the next step was. It was take a bigger role with a more global, scope, or do something really different. And I suppose when I sat down and did that sort of period of self-examination and reflection, I felt that my beating heart was in something about trying to change lives. And, that can sound a little bit cynical, but I wanted to make a difference. And I felt I'd been very lucky and privileged to have grown my role and that there was a lot I could bring to that. So it was really appealing. And I kind of put my hand up, and said, I would be interested in something like that. So there's a story how it gets there, but I indicated that I was happy to take a sort of a sideways, and it's not a lesser move, but just something different.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I think any organisation that considers it to be a lesser role has completely misunderstood the value that it brings. So yeah, it's fascinating. Thank you so much for that. It's really interesting kind of hearing about journeys. Phyll, I'm coming to you next in terms of, I was very interested when you were talking at the beginning about your kind of work, if you like, in the civil service and the trade unions, and then to now actually having founded UK Black Pride and now taking the executive director position as well. It's a similar frame of question to you, really, which is how much of that was planned, and you were studying in the side, and how much of it was, well, let's just see what drops and what's going to fascinate you most?
Well, it's interesting because what I didn't mention, my biggest job is I'm a mother. I'm a mother to the most amazing young lady who's 25, and that took priority over anything. So where people had careers much earlier on, I was doing, you know, what I would consider to be seen as low paid but essential worker role jobs, and also still trying to be a mother, coming out of a situation which was a bit volatile and unhealthy and a bit but I had always wanted to work in trade union settings. You know, my parents came over to this country as migrant workers, and my mum, she first joined NowGo because she used to work for Hackney Town Hall as a cleaner. So I was like, okay, I really want to be involved in the trade union movement, understand a bit more about, you know, workers' rights. So I think that my trajectory has always been about rights, whether it's workers' rights, whether it's human rights, whether it's, you know, the individual rights of someone just choosing to be, not choosing, being who they are and living their life the way they need to. It's been a roller coaster. I can't say that all of my work activities or all of my jobs that I've held have been extremely positive, because there's something that has prevented me from feeling like I can excel, that feeling like I can move forward, whether it's a racism, misogyny that exists in the workplace, whether it is about racism. I never wanted to make that the be all and end all of, you know, my working career. I wanted to ensure that I could overcome those barriers, because there have been many women before me that have done it. So yes, I pushed and pushed, and I think that I'm very determined. Some may call it bossy, I call it assertive. You know, some call it aggressive, I still call it very assertive. And that's been my working career of constantly pushing forward and ensuring that there's representation at all levels, and not just in a tokenistic way. You know, some people have always said, oh gosh, you're always going on about diversity, or you're always going on about inclusion and women being included at the top, Black people being included. That's because primarily, you know, we haven't historically owned and run and had those positions which come with, whether you call it power and leadership and authority. So it means that we have to carve out those spaces. It means that we have to create them. So if it means amplifying our voices at different times when it doesn't feel like it's the right time to do it, you know, we can't allow our beings to stop doing that. So yeah, my working career has been all about pushing forward. But I would say my greatest time was in the trade union whilst looking at political representation, not at the House of Lords level, but just our MPs. Who is it that's representing us, and how do we lobby? How do we engage? It was interesting to find that I was the only woman within that trade union setting that was having these conversations with our members. And, you know, great testament to people like Baroness, you know, Barker, who has been there at the forefront, and other MPs and lords and ladies that have allowed us to engage properly and allowed us to engage well. So, yeah.
Well, fabulous, thank you. And well, Liz, there's no better way to tee up a segue to you right at that moment. We were talking at the beginning about, you know, your work with the being the Liberal Democrats Lords spokesperson for the voluntary sector and equalities, and listening to what Phyll was saying there about, you know, representation of individual rights all the way through that journey. Winding back to your time with Age Concern, and then when you became a management consultant as well, I mean, again, it's a similar frame really, which is keen to hear you know, how you spotted the opportunities. Did you go for jobs that you thought, it's actually not what I want to do, but I know it's good for me to do? Did I take on, you know, jobs and functions where it wouldn't have necessarily fitted my personality style, but it's the right thing to do in order for me to get ahead?
Well, and listening to Phyll, she reminded me that in my younger days, I was a shop steward, and that was one of the best experiences that I ever had. And I think what I would say is that whichever, it hasn't really mattered which role I've been in. I'm actually a very good I'm a very good analyst of organisations and people, and that means that I can be quite creative. Not creative as in artistic or musical or anything like that, but very creative in terms of organisations and people. And wherever I've worked, I've always been able to spot a project or something that had to happen, and to go into that and to make that my own and to bring something out of it back to the organisation that they didn't have before. And that, I think, has also been, in some ways it's been augmented by the fact that, like Phyll, I had a whole other thing going on in my life, which was being politically active and learning to do things and picking up skills there. I mean, one of the things that I did for a long time was I was the person who was in charge of our party conference, all of it, everything, the political content, the organisation and everything. I was in charge of the first public event that happened in this country after September the 11th. And it was, believe me, it was one of the most fascinating and demanding things. And I had to lead all sorts of teams, volunteer teams through that. And that was a real challenge. So what I would say to people, I mean, particularly if you're, I always say this to the people in the city, you know, if you're doing something that is, to my mind, numbingly boring, like accountancy, there's got to be a project or something which is people related that will take you out of your comfort. Yeah, my out of my comfort zone is going into accountancy, actually, but for them, you know, coming out of their, it's about managing people. That's an invaluable thing. And I think that's why the three of us have told you that we managed to have a focus as a job, but we also had something else going on in our life that was building up our skill base, maybe in ways that weren't immediately obvious.
And it is, and the big thing I take away from all three of you is, you know, not only having the common thread throughout and being true to whatever interests you, but also the side learning, you know, the doing the evening classes, as Margot was saying, then also studying while you were going through as well, Phyll, which is absolutely right. And then find what really excites you and see the opportunity and ask for it and go for it. And don't wait for it to land in your lap, is to go, there's an opportunity. But what I do want to talk about is where the barriers have been, because, you know, this all sounds very utopian, you know, it's great and all this, but there's, you know, life isn't quite as smooth as that, really. So I'm really kind of keen to hear about some of the conscious barriers that you came across in your careers and how you sort of overcome them as well. And then also to explore, you know, what you think some of the barriers right now for the viewers and the listeners of this might well be. So Liz, I'm going to stay with you, if I may, just in terms of, you know, what was the first conscious barrier that you came across?
I think it was about being a member of different invisible minorities. You know, I grew up as the kid of a person with a disability. I grew up in a very religious household, but a minority religious household in a place where religion defined you. And then I kind of went on and I just, that sort of sense of not fitting in, that I think was a bit of and I have to be absolutely obvious, that I have to be absolutely honest and say, I wasn't a member of a visible minority. Members of visible minorities do get, but they are on the receiving end of hostility in a way that some of the rest of us aren't. But I think what it did, all of that did, was it led to the biggest barrier of all, which was not having enough self-confidence and being quite shy and retiring. You know, I always look at this, and I look at, you know, in the House of Lords, there are a team of peers who are gay, and most of them are men. Not all of them, but I love them to bits, and we get on very, very well on a cross-party basis. But we went to something one night, and I thought, I just noticed that they all walked down the front, and I went and sat at the back, and I thought, yeah, that's what women do. We go and sit at the back, and it's a confidence thing that I think is, and it is something that probably many of us, no matter how distinguished we are in our field, we still struggle away with that one.
Mm-hmm. And are there any tips you give any listeners about how to overcome that? And are there things you can
yeah, number one, you have to discipline yourself to stop beating yourself up about your shortcoming. You are the one who knows that you forgot to say something. Nobody else knows that, so don't tell them about it. And I would also say we are, when we do identify a weakness, I now discipline myself to go into that and deliberately put myself in places that I'm not comfortable with, and to try and work through stuff. That's what I would say.
Great. And Margot, you were nodding along to some of that in terms of the confidence question. But what's fascinating about me is actually when you tell your stories, it feels like from the very beginning you had the confidence to go, I know exactly where I'm going. What were some of the barriers that you came across throughout your career, and how have you overcome them?
Okay, and thanks. And I'm glad you think I had confidence. I probably had.
Comes over that way.
I had there's a word people use, probably rubberneck more than confidence. I just had an absolute, I suppose, determination to change my life, because the scenario I had seen growing up in rural Ireland was that, you know, women you either married somebody or you became sort of that person who was unmarried, who nobody, you know, provided for. There wasn't a future in the way that I wanted, and I wanted a better life. So I knew that, you know, I either had to escape and make for change, or you know, it wasn't such a pretty story. So I guess barriers for me, one was probably really overcoming the fact that my education had been pretty standard. You know, when I went into that working world, and particularly into management, I met a lot of people who had already had maybe different type of degree in business, etc. So I didn't have that background. I'd gone to a very average local school, convent school. I think from a religious perspective, I'd come from a very Catholic, very religious part of rural Ireland in County Limerick, and again trying to throw off the barriers of that. And I'd been shocked by, you know, some of the things that had happened in Ireland in that time, and again trying to walk away from some of that. And then I guess being female was also hard in the country. I really saw no role models, and I don't know if you're familiar with Mary Robinson, who latterly became our president, but she was the first really, you know, very, very positive role model that I saw. She became president in '91, and that was a real turning point. And I guess probably, you know, just simple things about maybe not having enough international experience. So all of those things were things that I've had to work on, and a little bit like the two previous speakers, I've had to overcome them by kind of facing the fear and doing it anyhow, and going out there and finding a way to turn it around. But you know, the last one I, you know, remember sort of, I suppose, a point was, I remember I did my master's about, it must be about 4 or 5 years ago now, and the day I went and I received, you know, the scroll for that master's, I felt I'd kind of arrived, because I always felt lesser than. So it was a really amazing moment, and getting married, I would say, was the same.
Fantastic, wonderful. And so Phyll, let me ask you a similar question in terms of you know, you were talking about study as well, just as Margot was, you know, there as well, and the value of study, and the kind of almost the kind of the weight that it brings to confidence. But along the way, I mean, you mentioned about misogyny, you've mentioned about, you know, some of those barriers. What was your experience?
Well, yeah, first of all, let me say I feel left out. You're all married. You know, clearly I've not found that right woman yet. So, yeah, and that's not a plug to DIVA.
You know, the unintended consequences of this debate is we're going to find you a partner.
We'll all help.
Thank you, thank you. See, that's what I mean, sisterly solidarity. I think that, you know, the barriers, like Baroness was saying at the beginning, you know, a visible minority discrimination that's there. I have no choice around being a Black woman. It's visible. So there will be things that I have and continue to face on a daily basis. You know, just by virtue of being on the tube, somebody that doesn't like my being because I'm a Black woman. But I think some of those barriers were taught to me early about what to expect. You know, I mentioned my parents came to this country. This was around, you know, Windrush era, and it was the no dogs, no Irish, no Blacks. So for my parents, they would tell me constantly, be careful where you go because people will not like you because of the color of your skin. I was so upset as a young child being told that, because I'm like, why would your parents tell you that you've got to be careful where you go to, you know, who you speak to, because, you know, you're a young girl, there's that, you know, a man or whoever could take advantage. But there was also the ability for somebody to hurt me, discriminate me because I'm Black. So there were always those barriers. And I don't know if it was so built in that my mother and father made it worse, or it was just an everyday occurrence and experience of what they had seen and what they've gone through. But I think for me, the barriers within the workplace, and the obstacles, some of it still hurts, some of it is still that lump in the throat, because there are times where you wished you would have challenged, there are times where you wish that you were unapologetic, but it is, as Baroness said, as Liz said, about confidence. You know, even now I can walk into spaces and everyone believes, oh my gosh, she has got this, she's so assertive and dominant, but actually I'm quite nervous about, you know, how I'd be received if I say something that doesn't match the language that one uses, you know, because English was never the first language of my family. So yeah, I think that those barriers, such as racism, sexism, misogyny, you know, disability discrimination, because there are hidden disabilities that one cannot see, you know, having friends who are Muslim, so that Islamophobia, all of those things exist in my world and have always existed. So it's not been something that is new that I've had to overcome. It's been something that I've had to constantly navigate my way through. It's been something that I have to constantly amplify my voice to make myself be seen, heard, and visible, like 365 days of the year. And I know I come across as, oh my gosh, all right, you know, we know that it may be bad, but actually it is bad. There are some people who are less fortunate than myself that don't get the opportunity to hold space within a workplace. So when we talk about coming out, whether it's in, you know, the commercial field, when we talk about you know, just being seen or applying for jobs, there have been things that have held me back, because I know already that the odds are stacked against me. And I now try to look at things in a way that, okay, I know that there's some real underlying inequality issues that, you know, exist within workplaces. But for me, it's how do I not just overcome them, but how do I bring people along with me? Because it's not just about the me here and now. I mentioned that I have a daughter. I want her to be able to carve out space in the work sphere that she's in without apology, without feeling that she has to go through the same routes and channels that I've had to go through, and the barriers and obstacles that exist. So most things that I do as a trade unionist has been about the collective, because you can't change something by yourself. Absolutely. You know, and I think it's a testament to the other speakers, you know, to Liz and to Margot. What they've done is they have created room and not pulled up the ladder behind them and just claimed and occupied these spaces. Yeah. They are talking quite openly about women holding space, about minority groups being part and parcel and very much part of the fabric of society and what we do. So I think that the challenges are also not having enough allies.
Yeah,
To
and
stand
I think it's
side.
it's a really important point, isn't it? Because the one dynamic is you see women who've got, and we see this a lot in the city, and actually there's a big movement to call it out, which is the whole thing about putting up the ladder behind you. You know, it's taken me years to get to this point. You have to work for whatever reason. I'm not going to help you. You've got to find your own way. That feels like that's changing, and the biggest narrative around that is about paying it forward. And role models, and what is immediately clear from this conversation is you're all amazingly kind of committed role models as well. I do want to explore actually in terms of what being a role model means to you, and in terms of how you do inspire others and pay it forward as well. So Liz, may I come to you first of all? Sort of when somebody says to you you're a role model, what do you think that means for you, and how do you display that?
Well, there was a really important moment for me, which was in 2013 during the discussion of the same-sex marriage bill as it was in Parliament, and I came out at work on the red benches. Nobody died, it was absolutely fine, much to my surprise. And it was, I mean, it was the worst kept secret in the world, but I had just never spoken publicly about it for a reason that every one of you will understand. My mum, you know, my mum and I never talked, and I waited until my mum had died before I did it publicly. And it was a huge moment, and I wanted to do it to have an impact, not for me, because my life didn't really change in many ways, but I wanted to do it for younger people. And I did. And since that moment, at that moment, I didn't realise until that moment how much me not being out had not just been a worry for me, but had been a great worry for people who cared about me. And so when the relief that I felt lifting off my shoulders, actually that happened for all of my friends and my family who cared about me. You don't have to bother about that anymore. And so what I have done since then is, I know a lot of people would say, well, I don't want to be the lesbian baroness. Well, I do, because there aren't that many of us. And I do deliberately use my place, the influence that I have. I've banged on and on and on about lesbian health and endlessly. We've had the first, you know, we've initiated the first discussion about intersex people in Parliament. You know, I did lots of work. And I also make sure that all of the community groups that I know about, you know, from the big ones that you all know, household names, through to tiny little ones like Para Pride, Opening Doors London. When I worked in Age Concern, we did the very first work on older people and HIV, and also older LGBT people. And that was about 30 years ago. And I'm a very, very proud patron of Opening Doors London and all the pioneering work they've done. And I actually go out of my way to make sure that people in our community and the groups that never thought that, like me, never thought that the House of Lords had anything to do with their lives at all, we're now in there. And I make it my business to be a spokesperson for them, you know, do loads of stuff with the Albert Kennedy Trust. In particular, I've just joined the board of Give Out, where we're raising money here to support activists throughout the world, particularly in difficult places. So although it's not my main job or all of my job, it's the best part of my job. And I really do it in the hope that one day there will be an even more diverse House of Lords sitting there, and our community will be absolutely at the heart of it.
And of course, what's amazing about that, hearing you tell that story with such passion, but is partly your role as a role model, partly about amplifying other voices and supporting others, but also being a real champion and catalyst driver for change all the way through that, which is amazing. Phyll, can I come to you at this point in terms of you know, you talk about your daughter with such joy, and you know, when you're paying it forward, obviously in the familial household, that's one way of doing it. I'd love to hear your other thoughts about, you know, when you're a role model, how do you pay it forward, and what does that mean for you?
I used to cringe at the word role model when people would say, oh, you're such a role model. But I also realized that I would look up to so many amazing women, especially lesbian women, that were stand out, whether it's Monica Bede or Femi Otoju, who was like the first Black lesbian woman on the lesbian and gay helplines. But when somebody says it now, I'm like, well, that means they can see something in me that they either aspire to, or that I'm giving them hope or some form of inspiration. I think what I do is really about opening doors. If there's a door that's been opened for me, I don't shut it behind me.
Mm-hmm.
If there's space that's made at a table for me to be able to speak to policymakers, to legislators, to MPs, well, I want to bring others along with me so that they can do that too. You know, there's this saying that I always say, my mum used to say it to me, to translate it is, you know, you don't inherit this land from your parents, you know, you borrow it from the next generation. So whilst I do everything to create space, I also want to ensure that the younger generation don't have to do the struggling that we may have had to do, but they're able to occupy spaces and confidently articulate themselves and remember and recall the rights that have been won through the hard work of others. And just continue to usualize the conversation of women, of Black people, of disabled people, of all of the many different facets that make us who we are, is to usualize that conversation. Because the moment we stop talking about it is the moment we've lost the, you know, the challenge on equality, diversity. And so, yeah.
So your line went a little bit choppy at the end there, but I think the spirit of what you're saying comes through loudly and clearly,
Yes.
in terms of not only sort of what you've learned from the generation that's come before you and those who have opened the door for you, but I love this whole passion you talk about, holding the door open, letting people in, let them bring them to the table, let them actually in many ways find their own voices as well, which is incredible. But to do it not just with a, this is the way it has to be done, it's just this kind of spirit and energy that you clearly embody. I love this whole thing about usualize, because that's exactly what we should be doing as well. And in an outside world, that's you know, that has its own challenges. But in a corporate world, of course, that's a microcosm of you know where I'm coming, Margot. It's a microcosm of where. Yeah, sorry.
One thing to that, because I think there's also something about our international sisters that, you know, they are in situations which are challenging and which are different than our own, and they often seek to the global south or the global north, sorry, for inspiration on how they can do things differently, how they can navigate spaces differently. So I think that we need to look at how we support others who are abroad. And of course, it's learning to deal with things in your back garden, but there's also a much bigger challenge of supporting those who are abroad.
Yeah, great point. Thank you for coming in on that. I think it's incredibly important as well. So Margot, I mean, this it's an international organisation, so it's an interesting sort of segue, because I do always talk about how corporates have a responsibility for the care for their employees and their communities around the world as well, particularly with LGBT rights. But I am very interested to come back to this question about a role model for you, because I understand you were the first, one of your roles was a CEO position, and you were the first CEO in Ireland to come out as well. I mean, you must get called a role model all the time. What does that mean for you?
Sure, and I mean, probably because there were so few. I mean, listen, just like the UK years before, there's, you know, I know loads of people, but it's the people who are probably a little more visible in the public eye. For me, listen, you know, it's a privilege, and it's something, you know, that I treasure, because I think, you know, it's about very like Liz and Phyll said, you know, it's about opening up the door for others. It's about having a voice. I'm a huge believer about we've got to be the change we want to see. So in corporate Ireland, you know, when I started sort of as a CEO, even, you know, from a point of view of across many strands of diversity and inclusion, when I first went to even events or chambers or meetings or boards, you know, I'd be the one woman or one of a few. So bit by bit, things have begun to change. And I think, you know, you absolutely have to be there. Your presence is important. Your voice is important. You're standing strong and tall in that space and holding the space for others. And then the other part is really making sure you take time to give something back. So one of the things I've done is work with entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs who are female, and try to help them to break into the business world, help them to form their companies, how to do their board, how to kind of get into a senior management role. So I take that mentoring and sponsorship, I guess, of other people as something that's really important. And, you know, in my day, if there'd been more women than that, I think it would have been faster, and I would leapfrog even faster. So I think it's important to give something back in that way.
And I'm a big fan of finding the accelerating factors and finding that, as you say, the leapfrog moments, if you like. And I think the mentorship, sponsorship, and also, you know, the visibility. And I love the fact that you've all talked about this concept of holding space for others, which in and of itself is a very generous thing to do. And I think as we're trying to go through our career journeys, and as we're trying to navigate our own personal journeys and corporate or whatever that is, organizational journeys, is quite often we could become kind of, this is what I want to achieve, it's what I want. But actually what we're saying is, on that journey, is open up, you know, let others in, don't be threatened by that, because actually the value and that the change that you can embody will be incredibly powerful as well. I can't believe how time has disappeared. I mean, it's incredible. So what I'd like to do is to ask you all, in really just a matter of, you know, 20-30 seconds, if you gave any advice to your younger self, what would that advice be? And Margot, I'm going to come to you first of all too. So looking back over the years, what advice would you give your younger self?
It's a great question. I when I've been asked that and it hasn't changed, is feel the fear and do it anyhow. You know, just do it. And I think I heard the others pick up that strain of put yourself in difficult places, get there when it doesn't feel comfortable, walk into the room, whatever it might be, just do it.
Fabulous, thank you. Liz, I'm coming to you next of all.
I think I would say grab every bit of education and help and learning that you find with both hands, no matter who it's from, and have the courage to do that, even if you think you might fail. And right now, listen. When they start talking about IT, make sure that you listen and find out as much as you can, and keep endlessly up to date and curious about change and innovation. That's what I would say.
Wonderful, thank you. And last but again, not least at all, Phyll, your thoughts on that?
Okay, so I'll be really brief. I would say you're not alone. There are so many people out there who can support, and
your line sadly has got a bit choppy. We left you as you're not alone, and then you went off on your own. So but I'm going to just see if we could get your line to settle a bit, because I'm very keen to hear your thoughts.
I know, I'm really sorry. I've got so many things on the go right now.
It's everybody's devices are all powered up. So why don't you take us through your final thoughts again?
So I would say that you're not alone, and you've got this. There are many people out there to help and support.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to leave the conversation there, but actually that's not it. This is the end of our live discussion over Zoom. Thank you all so much for your time. But actually, after this, we're going straight into a live Q&A. So any of our listeners, any of the viewers who've got any questions, please do come on the chat channel. Go to diva.com. They'll show you how to get there. And we would love to answer any of your questions. But there is a spirit, there is a definite spirit, and there is a tone that comes through this conversation. And it is about not only kind of that balance between commitment on a journey, be able to see the needs to work hard for a better future and how you grab that, but also recognizing where shortcomings might be, whether that's confidence, whether that's learning, and actually to be really brave and have the courage and the strength to know that you can do it, to go out and get it, and that there are people around you who can help you on your journey. It's been such a wonderful conversation. I can't thank each of you enough for doing this. And on behalf of everybody at DIVA, in Lesbian Visibility Week, it makes a huge difference. Thank you all.
Thank you.
you.
Stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you. Much appreciated.